Hello, everyone. My name is Arta Moini, and I am the Director of Research here at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. IPD is a nonpartisan international affairs think tank committed to promoting and amplifying provocative, innovative thinking in North Atlantic foreign policy. We stand for dialogue, diplomacy, prudent realism, and military restraint, principles which we believe are the four cornerstones of sustainable peace in an increasingly complex and dynamic international system. As a realist think tank, we provide a platform for interest-based discussions that set aside grand moralism and focus on crafting grand strategy tied to vital interests, realistically and pragmatically understood. In that spirit, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to today's program, where we have two stellar thinkers debate the West's current approach toward Ukraine and whether or not now is the right time and good strategy to push for diplomacy with Russia to try to end the war. The Ukraine war and its future is the most critical crisis facing the world today. Almost 6 months into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Russo-Ukrainian war has become a war of attrition with no clear end in sight. While many outsiders worry about the conflict spreading or escalating, both combatant sides believe time to be on their side. How this conflict will be resolved will have repercussions far outside of Ukraine and Eastern Europe. So naturally, informed persons disagree on how the West, and especially the United States, must proceed. The question at hand is whether or when it might be prudent to pursue a negotiated settlement or a ceasefire to wind down the hostilities. Can talks actually bear fruit at this stage, or will diplomacy now be simply naive or perhaps a photo op? Then there is a matter of who will be or should be the negotiating parties. Are any negotiations viable, absent the United States, which remains Kyiv's major backer despite Washington's lack of forces in Ukraine? Does Europe have the credibility to deliver on any diplomatic resolution given the failures of the Minsk agreement? And are the Ukrainian and the Russian leaderships ready to and able to make the kind of serious compromises that are needed to make any resolution work? Do they even have any interest to find a negotiated settlement? More broadly, is it wise for the West to seek accommodation with Russia in order to focus its resources and attention on more pressing geopolitical issues outside of Europe? Or does this war offer the United States and its allies a unique opportunity to degrade the foundations of Russian security presence in Europe? And if so, how does a weakened and humiliated Russia benefit us in a more regionally focused and multipolar world characterized by the rise of China? So without further ado, let me turn to my colleague, Zachary Pakin, a research fellow here at IPD and our in-house Europe expert, to introduce our guests.
Well, thank you very much, Arta, and it's an excellent introduction to a very timely topic, and we are very grateful to be welcoming you, our audience today, to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, and in which we will be having today, as Arta just outlined, a debate between two eminent thinkers, and we're particularly proud today that we're not only able to have a civil debate between different perspectives on very complex and difficult issues, but also that we're able to have this debate particularly from an interest-based perspective, and to understand the different interest-based perspectives and competing perspectives on U.S. grand strategy, and indeed on Western foreign policy more broadly as well. So without further ado, today our two debaters arguing in favor of the motion. We have Barry Posen, who's the Ford International Professor of Political Science at MIT, and he joins us today from just outside Boston, Massachusetts. Barry, thank you so much for being with us today. And second of all, arguing against the motion, against the notion that there should be any sort of negotiated solution at the present time to the war in Ukraine is Andrew Michta, who is the Dean of the College of International and Security Studies at the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies, and he's joining us today from Bavaria in southern Germany. Andrew, thank you for being with us as well. Just a very short disclaimer that the positions that are going to be advanced by both debaters today are exclusively the positions of the debaters themselves. They do not represent the institutions with which they're affiliated, nor the position of any government of any country. So how this is going to work is I'm going to turn the floor over to Barry first, and each debater will have the opportunity for a 5-minute opening statement. We'll give each of them the chance after that for a rebuttal. And then there will be some particular questioning from Arta and myself to the two of them, and we will open the floor as well. 2 questions from our audience. So if you would like to pose a question at any point in time, please do so using the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your screen. Thank you again all for being with us. And Barry, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. It's a sad occasion for a discussion, obviously, but it's a serious matter. So I think it's good that we can get together and talk about it from different perspectives. So I think the West should be trying to move towards a negotiated solution, or at least a negotiation, quite soon. And I think so for two broad reasons. One set of reasons is internal to the war, and one set of reasons has to do with the West's own interests. So the reason internal to the war, I discussed it in my foreign affairs piece, and we can come back to it later, is that I see the war as being at a kind of stalemated equilibrium. This doesn't mean nothing moves. It just means that each party keeps reaching into its reserves to try and find some way to change the facts on the ground, and they seem to be unable to do it. We know that each has taken enormous casualties, not clear how enormous, but quite enormous. Each has suffered, for one reason or another, damage to its economy. Each is managing so far to weather that damage. Each is finding new contributions of manpower and women power and materiel, right? So when I look at the war, it looks to me like the two parties are at loggerheads. And, there's a lot of theorizing in the international relations world that basically says wars are disputes about relative power and relative will, right? Each war is about its own thing, but that issue cannot be settled because the two parties cannot measure their relative power and relative will. So in the end, they fight to do so. And I would say that we've had a measurement of relative power and relative will. Both sides have a lot of capability. Both sides have a lot of willpower. And the dynamics of the battlefield, I think, are starting to lock up. So this strikes me as a moment. Now, this doesn't mean that the players understand or accept this is where they are. They may have a profound desire to keep fighting and keep measuring. But I think those of us who are not immediately in the fight, who have some distance, can have a perspective on this and see the direction of things. And it's in our interest to try and move them to this understanding and then try and move them to some sort of solution. Now, the second set of reasons why we should want to move toward negotiation has to do with the various risks that the West is assuming, indeed that the world is assuming, by having this war proceed, right? And the first thing I would say is that the West's interests in this war were not huge, right? If the West had a truly vital interest in this war, the West would be in the war. If we had a truly vital interest in Ukraine, Ukraine would have been in NATO, right? Our interest is that there be a relatively well-defended, militarily kind of neutralized buffer zone between Europe's, NATO's borders and the Russian border. It doesn't mean that the Ukrainians should be disarmed, far from it, but it does mean that I think it's our basic interest is that there be basically a big buffer zone between us and them. That's the only major positive interest that I can see. Our real concern right now has to be, I think, different kinds of escalation. That's the big risk. And there are several kinds of escalation, not one. One is nuclear, and we should always be concerned about nuclear escalation. And we can go into some of the different ways this could happen. It doesn't have to start with one side or the other getting up in the morning and deciding a general thermonuclear war is a good idea. It's just with this level of military interaction and all these weapons firing one way or the other, nuclear weapons in the mix, there's a lot of scope for mistakes. Escalation to nuclear war is a very, very big risk. And to my mind, we haven't actually been quite sufficiently cognizant of it, although President Biden, in his initial observations about the war and the limit of our engagement, basically admitted that this was not worth that. There's also other kinds of escalation to people who aren't studying war very often. It seems like this war is already really, really awful. And it surely is really, really awful, but it can get a lot worse. Right. And we should understand that each side will be looking for ways to get after the other. And it can get a lot worse. It can also expand geographically. Now, there's many other equities that we have in here that should make us really want to pursue a negotiated solution now. But I'd see the two main things I would say is that the time is ripe, or if it's not ripe yet, it may soon be ripe. And we have to start thinking about how we're going to use that ripeness. And second, we have to be cognizant of the costs and risks that we and the rest of the world are running every day that this war proceeds.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Barry, for helping us kick off this debate. Without further ado, let's pass it off to Andrew immediately.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for having me. And let me emphasize again, my views are my own, not representing the Marshall Center, the Defense Department, or the U.S. government. Let me take a slightly different approach than Barry did, and I'll come back to Ukraine later on. But let me try to lay out some larger principles here from my perspective. First of all, this is not just a one-off crisis. This is not a war between two states. This is part of a larger reconfiguration that has been ongoing in Europe for the last 20 years, and part of the larger, what I call a two-front crisis that Russia and China have created for us at a time when we're coming off from 20 years of CT operations, overseas contingency operations, and reformatting our military for great power competition. So this is a very acute crisis from my perspective. Secondly, the reason I say Ukraine is not a one-off issue, it's because in my assessment, there are no one-country solutions to the security dilemmas on the eastern flank. There have to be regional solutions. And the idea that we can somehow end up having a buffer zone if we get to a negotiated settlement at a time when most of Donetsk and Luhansk has already been taken over, the Ukraine is being effectively cut off from access to the Black Sea, we would end up in effect with Putin's victory in place. And I would argue that that victory essentially would transform Ukraine into a failed state, not a buffer state, but a failed state, number one. And number two, probably within 2 years, not 5 or 7 years, as some analysts predict, would lead to another campaign at a time when Ukrainians probably would not be as psychologically ready, as united as they are today to pursue this. Let's keep in mind one thing. Ever since, I recall 2007, Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference, where he in effect declared war on the West. The 2008 Georgia, 2014 Ukraine, 2015 Syria, and now Ukraine 2022. These are, in my book, discrete campaigns, and kinetic campaigns in that attempt to revise the power distribution in Europe. And if you remember what his demands were just before he started the military operations, he in effect wanted a sphere of influence that would annul everything that happened essentially post 1995-96, including the NATO enlargement cycle of the first and subsequent cycles as well. So the reason I believe that we have a vital interest here, there are several. One, his victory right now, and I insist that any sort of negotiated deal that would freeze the status quo would amount to Putin's victory, risks a wider war in Europe. Secondly, Barry makes an argument that, if we had something riding on this conflict, we would be in this conflict. I could have made the same argument in the 1930s, in the late 1930s. If Europe had something at stake in confronting Germany, it would have reacted when Czechoslovakia was dismembered or others. What is happening, especially in Europe, since I'm sitting here on my perch, is the stakes are not being translated by leaders to the dinner table conversation level. There's no communication of how fundamentally the world has changed, with few exceptions. And to support my argument, I would say the fact that Finns, who for decades, essentially since the end of the Second World War, maintained their status as a neutral power, have shifted gears and literally within 2 or 3 months went from 23% of support for NATO membership to 75% support for NATO membership, speaks volumes about how countries, especially those that are along the flank and not necessarily post-Soviet countries, realize the immediacy of this threat, that they're facing a potential of Russian aggression. Finally, the risks that we talk about, the risk of escalation, the risk of this widening, these risks are there, but I am among those who believe that, especially at this stage, the risk of nuclear escalation is not as high as some scholars argue, and I'm happy to get into this conversation. The Russian military of today is not the Soviet military of the Cold War era. Please remember that in addition to the Red Army, the Red Navy and the Red Air Force and other forces within the Soviet portfolio, there were 54 non-Soviet Warsaw Pact divisions. The Russians were deeply entrenched in the heart of Europe. The Russian army of today is nowhere near that level. And finally, let me conclude by the following, because I remember reading in Barry's essay that there are only two paths of victory in Ukraine, one that would potentially lead through Ukraine, the other one that would lead through Moscow. I would actually disagree. I think the real path for victory here leads through the West. It leads through the capitals of Western Europe, through Washington, and through all democratic capitals in the world. Because quite frankly, if you look at what even limited assistance to Ukraine when it comes to long-range artillery, missiles, and weapons of this kind, the changes that has already brought on the battlefield in terms of what used to be simply a war of attrition, what is now becoming a different type, probably a third phase of this campaign, that shows me, and I would argue that given the right support, that is a not just a political unity, but a willingness to take risk across the Western community, and this willingness varies considerably, that could be a game changer, and I would argue that the Russian military could be defeated in Ukraine.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andrew. Barry, I'm sure you have lots of things to say in response, so go ahead.
Well, we could organize it or not. I'm actually going to try not to take up sort of every point, because then it will get boring for people. I just want to take up one point, right? And it's the point raised in the last few observations that Andrew made, right? At the beginning of his talk, Russia's 10 feet tall. It's a superpower, a combined threat with China that's going to change the post-Cold War order. It's a humongous threat, to use a euphemism. At the end of the talk, Russia's actually quite weak and a shadow of the USSR. Well, I think it's closer to the second than the first, but not perfectly. And because I think it's closer to the second than the first, I don't think that the stakes or the difficulties at this moment in terms of dealing with Russians, the Russian, we'll call it its energy or its expansionist inclinations, right? I don't think it's all that hard to manage, right? I mean, we dealt with the Soviet Union once through a policy of containment that included quite a lot of negotiation and quite a lot of deterrence and the seeking of a modus vivendi and patient waiting, right? So it seems to me that this much diminished Russia that has lashed out, we can talk about the history, why they lashed out, but has lashed out in this savage and I think even in its own interest, ultimately counterproductive way, right? I think I think the interest of everyone on their periphery is served by calming the waters, right? And now the second thing I would say, and I just put this in parentheses, whenever you want to fight a war or do anything else, there's a strong propensity to oversell the objectives and to understate the cause, right? And I think in the case of Ukraine, I find the notion that a stabilized front, however it's stabilized, even the loss of Donetsk and Luhansk will somehow become the lever that causes complete collapse for the Ukraine. To me, this is a very odd causal chain relative to the Ukraine that we've observed. The Ukraine that we've observed is one that's undertaken a patriotic and nationalist mobilization. It's a heroic mobilization. We all have observed it. We all respect it, right? This doesn't seem like the kind of country that just folds up. Finland was alluded to. Finland, in the end, had to do the most awful thing, which was concede at least 10% of its real estate to the Russians after 2 bloody wars, right? Did Finland collapse afterwards? No. The same nationalist motivation that kept them in the fight sustained them in their efforts to recover their country and make a way for themselves in the Cold War and into the post-Cold War world. I have no way of figuring out why Ukraine's going to go binary in the event of some sort of diplomatic or negotiated solution. So those are only 2 points I'll make at the moment. We can come back to others. I'm sure you'll want to raise them.
Okay, so if I may respond. So Barry, I think you're misrepresenting what I have said. Power is not just absolute numbers. The point I was making is that the Russian military power and economic power relative to where Soviet military power was is a pale shadow of that, and I stick by it. But power is also relative. The Russian threat to Europe has to be taken in the context of a de facto disarmament of some of the key members of the alliance. If you look at the reductions in equipment, in training, in personnel that has occurred in Europe consistently since the end of the Cold War, with very, very few exceptions, then that's one part of this conversation. The second part is the structure of the U.S. joint force. You know, we are now formatted for one major theater, and we're confronted by 2 near-peer military adversaries. Even with the Germans committing 100 billion euro to rearm, you know, they're buying the F-35s, they're buying the heavy helicopters from us. It's going to take probably up to a decade to restore the capability of Europe to provide for deterrence. On your point on Finland, Finland, yes, had to give up territory, but there were certain things that worked in its favor at the end of the Second World War. One was its location, to be quite honest. I mean, I would be very hard pressed to assume that the Russians would go for any sort of compromise like that with countries that were right at the central front, critical to access to their positions in Germany. So yes, Poland also lost probably 30% of its territory, became a satellite. This is a historical question about what motivated Stalin to treat the Finns differently, but I would argue that that comparison here is not accurate. The Russians, I've always argued that the Russians are never as strong as they claim to be, and they're also never as weak as some people believe it to be. So dismissing the Russians now, that's not what I'm doing. What I'm saying is the first campaign that they fought, which was a very poorly designed campaign, they wanted to decapitate the Ukrainian government, replace it with its own puppet regime, that failed because of their atrocious logistics, poor quality of their weapons, poor quality of their troops and their training. They have reverted essentially now to a war of attrition, and that war of attrition appears to be the status quo, but largely because the Ukrainians did not have the capacity for long-range counter-battery fires. That is changing. And if you look at the levels of casualties that the Ukrainians have been taking, as opposed to what was happening just a few months ago, I would argue that we may be entering into a third phase. The larger question is this: is the West willing to mobilize to support Ukraine to get to a point where negotiations would be anything but a de facto win for the Russians? And I don't believe we're at that stage.
Andrew, could I just jump in and ask you to clarify something regarding the balance of power question that's alluded to a little bit here, and how strong or weak Russia allegedly is. You've written in the past that what Europe may need going forward is some sort of new intermarium in Central and Eastern Europe, which would rest upon the notion of a new balance of power in which Russia in relative terms has been weakened. I'm wondering how Russia's relative power over the longer term fits into your calculations on this front, because we've seen Russia go through, throughout its history, through different periods of weakness and strength. We've seen its relative power reduced significantly, for example, after the Russian Civil War, again after the collapse of the USSR. But in both cases, we saw within the matter of a few decades, Russia's national power being effectively restored. So, what is your calculation that you're pricing into here regarding Russia's relative power and how that fits into U.S. national interests?
Well, I mean, I would argue that to a large extent, Putin's attempt to come back into Europe and reestablish Russia as a key player in European politics is a combination. One is the neo-imperial drive, the narrative that he's been pushing, that the Russian people and the Russian army were never defeated, they were betrayed. And you take your pick from Gorbachev back to Lenin and forward to Yeltsin. I mean, it's the kind of a narrative of an aggrieved imperialist, something that, by the way, we saw in the interwar period in Germany. There was the same narrative post 1918 about the Dolchstoss and how the German army was never defeated but was betrayed. Secondly, the fact that Europe's energy policy, and here a lot of burden rests on Germany, has in effect opened the door for Putin to accumulate resources and to create a dependence in Europe. And I would argue that it's that energy dependence that drives a lot of European politicians to essentially a position where they refuse to acknowledge how grave the situation is, because the economic considerations are still in the back of their minds or in front of them. Just to make this point, I mean, Germany alone was in 2014 about 35% dependent on Russian gas. This has pretty much doubled. There are only 3 remaining nuclear reactors in Germany. And the ongoing debate about shutting them down or keeping them running is something that is kind of indicative where the conversation is going. What was going to be interdependence, right, between Russia and the European economies have been demonstrated to be dependence. And Putin is banking on this and leveraging on this. If you look at in terms of the size of the GDP, depending on how you count, the Russian economy is about 1/4 or 2/5 of the German economy alone. So this is not a problem of resources. The West is extremely wealthy, capable of fielding sufficient militaries to deter any attempt at
I want to step in here for a second, Andrew, because your characterization of I think one has to divide one's characterization of European militaries into two kind of pods. One is the raw inputs. The raw inputs are fine. Europe spends vastly more on military power than Russia does, and Europe has more people under arms than Russia does. Europe's problem is lack of seriousness. That's the problem, right? There's no special reason why Russia, in its current stage, should be able to lord it over Europe militarily, and you yourself have admitted it. The real question here is, are the Europeans going to fix up their forces? It's not that they need to be a lot larger. Right? Who knows how much more they really need to spend to fix them up, but the bulk of the spending has happened already.
Oh, Barry, right? I disagree. First of all, percentage.
Look, it doesn't matter whether you disagree or don't disagree. These are the facts of the case.
No, they're not.
Go look at NATO's own spending estimates. Look at the U.S. Look at
one second. Andrew has the floor. Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, don't try to shout me down. Just let me respond. First of all, how you spend on the military in terms of percentage of your GDP is not a meaningful indicator, because it depends on the structure of your defense spending. If you spend 80%, as some countries do, on personnel costs, you don't have exercised real military capabilities to field. That's number one. Number two, the lack of military mobilization makes these forces non-deployable and non-interoperable, not just with the United States, but within Europe itself. This is not about numbers per se. This is about what these forces can do. An air force that can fly, I mean, I'm being flippant here, just in circles over a capital is not an air force, it's a flight club. They've got nice uniforms, but they cannot deploy according to NATO's operational planning. So no, I strongly disagree. If you look at, even in numerical terms, in sheer numbers, 90% decline in units of equipment. If the French sent to Ukraine 1/3 of their long-range artillery, and that amounts to 12 Caesar howitzers, that tells you what you need to know. This is not about how much money you spend. It's about exercise military capabilities that the alliance can plug into the operational plan. Europe is nowhere near that.
Okay, let's try to bring things a little bit back towards the topic at hand, which is, should we or should we not be actually looking for some sort of negotiated settlement at the present time? Is it in our interest to do so? Let's go back to one of the points that Andrew was making in his opening remarks. And Barry, I'm going to ask this question to you, which is that there's an argument that we often hear that Russia must be stopped now, because if they don't, then there's not going to be any disincentive whatsoever for them to try again at some point as Andrew said, possibly even as soon as 2 years down the road. So what's your response to that?
The disincentive that they'll have to try down the road is that they get to have the same fight again. And although they may recover their military power for the fight, the Ukrainians will have a chance to recover their military power for the fight. And the West, as Andrew points out, which is far richer than Russia, has 2 years to recover its military power for the fight. So it seems to me that what's going to help encourage the Russians to hew to any agreement that they might sign is the risk that they would incur by starting the music again. And I think those risks turned out to be higher this time than they expected. And they would have every reason to believe they'd be even higher the next time. So what defends whatever arrangement you can make is the same thing that defends any country on a day-to-day basis against challengers, which is its ability to deter, right? So I don't really see how that changes 2 years from now in a way that's particularly inimical to Ukraine's interest. The only way you can make the argument that it's inimical to Ukraine's interest is if you believe that Ukraine is weak of will and the West is weak of will, and the Russia will focus full bore on sharpening up their knives, and the relative disparity between the Russians and the Ukrainians is going to grow. It's not going to remain what it is today or even shrink. Right. And I don't know why you would believe that, given, again, everything that Andrew has said about all the cards that the West holds on the material side of things, or that most observers believe is the mobilized nature of the nationalist spirit of the Ukrainian people. So I don't see that that's the main cost. There may be some cost, but that cost does not strike me to be the main one.
Andrew, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I mean, look, when I say that the West has resources and wealth, it doesn't mean that these resources can be put to national defense or that there's any sort of willingness. Just as I once quipped to a colleague, just because you're fat doesn't mean you're strong. You know, without the leadership and the mobilized population, a clear articulation of what's at stake, it doesn't really matter how much more affluent you are, because the priorities are going to be moving in different direction. And quite frankly, right now, as you look at the approaching winter in Europe, that level of support, you know, for Ukraine regaining its territories and regaining its independence is becoming softer because the priorities of inflation, energy costs, et cetera, are coming to a fore. Second point, Ukraine reconstituting its military. I said recently on an EU panel that they continue to maintain kind of looking long-term at the cost of reconstructing Ukraine. 2 weeks ago, the estimates were 600 billion euro. Right now, it's trillion euro and counting. The Ukrainian economy is being ground down. They cannot export grain. They have no access to their industrial base. The notion that Ukraine on its own could reconstitute its military with an economy wrecked as completely as it has been, and Putin is doing this in a very methodical way, that simply is not, in my view, in the cards. And the last thing, you don't know, and I don't know, and then I think this is sheer speculation, whether in 2 years or 3 years from now, the West would be willing to at least politically unite behind Ukraine as it has so far, number one. Number two, to what extent, having suffered a defeat, because the Ukrainians would perceive any sort of negotiated deal right now without any territorial restoration, any victory in the field, as Putin's win. This would be extremely demoralizing, I would argue. And if Zelensky agreed to anything like that, he would stop being Churchillian. He would become a quisling to his people. So these are all kind of very easy assumptions that Barry is making. But I think when measured against the hard realities of this war, there are too many unknowns. And when it comes to Ukraine rebuilding its military without Western assistance, that's simply not possible.
So Andrew says that, go ahead, Barry, go ahead.
I didn't say they would be rebuilding their military.
You said that they would restore their military.
I said they will get a stronger military because during the 2 years that the Russians are sharpening their knives, I believe Ukraine would be sharpening theirs. And for the last, I don't know how many years has it been since the beginning of the joint forces operation. Since 2014, the Americans have done nothing but help the Ukrainians build up their military power, and we've anteed up big time now. And I think that any negotiated settlement is going to have to be supported by some continuing support from the United States, probably a significant one. That's not really an issue here. What I think I hear you saying is that, and I actually, it's confusing to me, because it sounds to me like what you're saying is that the safest course of action to keep the war going is to keep the war going. But I can't really tell. I can't really tell.
Where did I say that?
Well, what you say is that if the war stops, Ukrainian morale is going to collapse, Western morale is going to collapse, everyone's attentions are going to go somewhere else, right? That peace or even a truce, right, is fraught with risk.
No, I'm just arguing that,
but the war is somehow not fraught with risk, even though you yourself just said that somehow they've lost the Ukrainian economy needs $600 billion to rebuild it. If the war goes on, it's going to be 700, 800, 900, 1,000. The cash register is just going to keep adding figures, right? So I'm having a hard time figuring out how you're so sure that continuing the war is the better course of action than trying to stop it, because it seems to me that it's at least equally risky.
Barry, if you let Andrew
representing what I've said. So now let me respond to this, okay? Because I am not arguing for continuing the war. I am arguing for the West to come together to understand that a strategic objective in this war, if you are to get to any sort of negotiation that will be both acceptable to the Ukrainian people. By the way, they also get a vote. It's their country, it's their army, it's their territory. It's very easy to give away somebody else's territory and say, they need to accept the settlement, this, then the other. They're in this war, and and they're the ones who are paying the price. And it's not Andrew speaking, it's the Secretary General of NATO who said, pay the damn money to rebuild the European militaries because the Ukrainians are paying with their lives. No, what I'm arguing is to get us to a position but any sort of a negotiated settlement would not surrender Ukrainian sovereignty. A settlement right now, where you have essentially the Russians increase their holdings to the point that they control most of eastern Ukraine now, Donetsk, Luhansk, the industrial center, if you will, of Ukraine, where they control access to the Black Sea for the most part. They're very close to threatening Odessa, which opens up the whole issue of NATO's southern flank. No, that is not a time to go to a negotiated settlement. So I'm not arguing for prolonging the war. I'm arguing for giving the Ukrainians the resources to create conditions on the ground that would make meaningful negotiations and settlement possible. But what I'm saying is the current situation, where if you look at how different allies in Europe are responding, the US is leading, with the Brits, the Poles, and the Baltics. The Germans are lagging with the French. The rest of it is kind of in between. That is not a recipe for resolution in my mind. But I'm not arguing that prolonging the war is somehow good.
So Barry, let me just pose a little question to you to clarify something that you said. You said that over the next 2 years or so, the Ukrainians would sharpen their knives, the Russians would sharpen theirs in the event of a negotiated solution. I'm wondering if you could explain why you think that's actually a situation that would be in the U.S. national interest. Because if there's one thing that we've learned from why this war took place, and there are many causes for it, of course, but it's that Russia was not prepared to allow Ukraine to sharpen its knives at all. That seemed like a red line for them. So if I'm Vladimir Putin and I launch a war against Ukraine, and I realize that the worst thing that can happen to me is I'll end up with more territory than I had before, and have consolidated my rule more than before, irrespective of what happens to my armed forces and the people who are fighting for them. What's the disincentive for more instability down the road?
I think he's muted.
I mean, the question is sort of like, how do we get out of where we are, right? That's the problem. We are where we are, right? So when you think about what a negotiation might look like, right? Russia doesn't get everything it wants. Ukraine doesn't get everything it wants, and we don't get everything that we want, right? So I think that part of a negotiated solution is going to be Ukraine having a status as an armed neutral. And an armed neutral gets to have arms, right? And there's not that much they can do about that, right? Now, I think one of the things we have to throw into the kitty, and the Ukrainians have to throw into the kitty, and I think even President Zelensky hinted at it early on when the war started, was that, Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations will have to be limited in some way, right? And that basically Ukraine's not going to be a member of NATO. And we can see, looking at the present situation, that for Western countries to help Ukraine defend itself, Ukraine doesn't need to be a member of NATO, right? So I think that would be an important gain for Russia. And Ukraine has already hinted that, in contrast to its view prior to the war, that now that they've seen what this all means, that maybe that is a possibility, right? Now, there are other things in the mix, right? I mean, there's an assumption that that any negotiation would mean that all territory upon which the Russians now sit is going to be Russian. We don't know if that's the way negotiations going to turn out or not. It depends on what kind of incentives you can offer the Russians. Right? It may be that if they can be sure that Ukraine's not going to be a NATO member, maybe some of this real estate, some of these parts of Ukraine that they were now sitting on, and by the way, de facto kind of annexing, right? I mean, they're sinking the roots of their state into this real estate, which is going to make it harder to get it back. With each passing day, they sink their roots deeper, right? It's in our interest to stop this process. It's in Ukraine's interest to stop this process. Right? So, go ahead.
I'm going to push back and ask, do you think it's in Russia's interest right now to actually be incentivized to do negotiations with the West or with Europeans at this juncture? Because they also might think that they're benefiting from this war, as just let known.
Well, it just really just depends on whether you think that my perception that both sides are, if they don't already understand that they're stalemated, that they will find themselves stalemated, and there's not much gain, right? Andrew pointed out that, the first phase of the Russian offensive failed, right? They're not going to eliminate Ukraine as an actor. This fight is now about pieces of Ukrainian land and how those pieces of Ukrainian land will be governed politically. That's what the fight is now about. It's not about Ukrainian sovereignty. The Ukrainians won that fight. They're an independent nation. It's proven it can defend itself, proven that it can find allies. The question that the fight is about now, and it's an ugly one, is what are Ukraine's borders going to be? What are Russia's borders are going to be? Right. That's what the fight is about.
Right. But if us, if President Biden, if through back channels we reach out to the Kremlin and try to start the negotiations on our part with them, even on behalf of Ukrainians, do you think at this juncture, before autumn, Putin or Russia will be willing to actually play ball on that, or will they wait until?
I have no idea. I mean, again, in other words, look. People who talk about hurting stalemates in war, they also will make the observation there's a lot of ruin in a nation. So the condition that I think I see, it's quite likely that the actors don't see it and won't see it for quite some time, that they'd like to beat, their inclination is to beat one another to a bloody pulp, right? But I think it's also the case that Russia's experienced considerable reverses, and I think that they can see that the Americans keep feeding new capabilities into Ukraine. Ukraine keeps digging deep and finding things in its own arsenals or in its own population, and that this war is not going to get easier for Russia either, right? And that's the incentive, that this war is not going to get easier for them. Now you could say, okay, they may believe that a simple territorial stalemate in which they sink their tentacles into the land they've taken, and they use their military to fend off Ukrainian offenses, and I think they have a good chance of doing that. basically because their army is larger and because they will have the tactical advantage of the defense. I don't think Western technology can overcome this, given that the numerical disparity. So I think that the Ukrainians will want to keep the Russians from consolidating their capability. I understand that's what they want to do. I just don't think it's going to be very easy for them to do it. So my only point here is that the two sides can beat each other up for another year or so, right? And get to where I think we can see that they're going and maybe satisfy themselves that that's all they can get. Or perhaps, again, through some sort of negotiation, you can get the parties together and start manipulating some incentives and threats that the United States has to play, both with Russia and Ukraine, to try and see if we can open things up diplomatically. From my point of view, the worst that happens is diplomacy fails. And you could ask yourself the question, who was that worse for? I'm not actually sure it's worse for us. It may be worse for the Russians.
I think a fundamental sort of disagreement, if I may, between you and Andrew is that Andrew thinks that it is possible to turn the course of the war and have Ukraine regain territories. I'm assuming
I think he's been clear about that, but he wants to add a point, so we should let him.
Yeah, could I just add a point? Because there's several things that Barry said that I just have to take issue with. First of all, the kind of notion that we have to accept that Ukraine will not be in NATO, will not be in the West, will not be in the transatlantic community. That implies that for Putin, the driver here was supposedly the intent of the United States to bring Ukraine into NATO. I've heard the same stuff when it came to Georgia. Everything we know about the alliance and how the internal dynamic works, Putin knows perfectly well. The minute he occupies portions of Georgia, there's no way in hell that Georgia would ever make it into the NATO alliance. The minute he occupies portions of Ukraine, he knows there's no chance, because you would in effect be asking the ally to vote for bringing in the country that is in a state of war. So I look at Putin's intentions very differently. You know, Barry assumes that some sort of a rational cost-benefit assessment here can play into both the Russians and the Ukrainian coming to the negotiating table. I'll just cite Vladimir Putin. Quote, Russia is not even, Ukraine is not even a state. Okay, Ukraine is not even a state. The war that he is fighting is not a war against Ukraine. He's fighting a special operation to denazify Ukraine. Filtration camps, shipping children and large numbers of Ukrainian population to the Russian interior. These are not policies and behavior of a government that wants to end up in a negotiated settlement. I would argue that Putin's intent from the very beginning was to pursue his vision of Novorossiya that he spoke about repeatedly since about 2014. And that the game for him is not to get to a position where Ukraine remains as a sovereign state, but to, in effect, absorb Ukraine into Russia, whether in one fell swoop or in installments. That's just a question of time. We have seen this already happen to a large extent with Belarus. The Belarusian military is fully integrated with the Russian military when it comes to command and control. The fact that the Russians can retrieve damaged equipment through Belarus, can drive in supplies, ammunition, fuel, and all of this through Belarus, retrieve their wounded. This shows us, I think, what his vision is for this restored Russian imperial state that has the Great Russian core. It's got the Belarusian and the Little Russian / Ukrainian component. So I just looking at the policies that Putin has pursued and his intent and his statements and his actions, I do not believe that he's interested. And I think this goes, Arta, to your question, would the Russians be interested in negotiating a deal? I would submit to you that they're not.
Okay, Andrew, I'm going to actually follow up.
Let's find out.
I'm going to follow up on something that Andrew said, because you know, in the beginning of your remarks, you talked about both Russia and China as near peer competitors. But then I think the question of relativity of power is very important here, right? So I mean, we came up with a project recently at IPD where we actually named Russia as sort of a middle power, and it's obviously relatively weaker than the Soviet Union was. some would argue that any sort of move to conclude this war so that we can focus on the prominent security threat coming from China is a good thing for the West and for the United States. And you have written a lot about the security concern about China, and you mentioned it again today. So my question to you is, that political settlement, putting aside the question of Russians and the Ukrainians, is it better for the West for this war to end so that we can focus on China?
Again, and on what terms, right? And in what fashion? And what the end state would be for the Ukrainian state as a sovereign entity, or one that is not viable and increasingly at the mercy of Moscow. And this is not a trivial question. This is a fundamental question in my view. I've got a running argument with a number of people, including my good friend Bridge Colby, who is arguing that we should focus on the Indo-Pacific, that Ukraine is a distraction. Well, to me, the response is exactly, if at the end of the two-frontier trap, Russian defeat in Ukraine allows us to reshift the resources, if you will, and assuming that the Europeans will rearm, we'll have to bridge for a while, for several years in Europe, even if the Europeans become serious about rearmament, because it will take time. The lead times, there's no surge capacity in European defense industry. Okay, that's the first thing. And the second thing is, I believe that we have at present, we are in a situation where the Russians who are touting their numerical superiority, remember that Putin is mobilizing mainly in the Far East. He's mobilizing in non-European parts of Russia. That's where he draws the recruits. I would argue he's very concerned about the domestic implications if he has to go to major cities like Petersburg or Moscow, because this will start impacting on the so-called middle class in Russia, and this will make this war come home. Right now, I mean, even recruiting from prison seems to be his preferred option than recruiting and mobilizing the population. So there is a domestic dynamic here as well. This is not just a calculus of how many people, what the population of a nation is, what the numerical storage might be in terms of the ammunition and all post-Soviet stocks. Remember that Ukraine must and is transitioning to Western weapons simply because the post-Soviet stocks are being depleted outside the Soviet Union itself. That's number one. And number two is fundamentally the performance. I mean, when we're looking at how the Russian weapons have been performing, I would argue that given the right support, again, I'm coming back to the same point. A consensus in the West, not only on political support, but also on military support, because we have a stated consensus on political support for Ukraine. We want to maintain Ukrainian sovereignty, and I think that's also stated at the political level. If you look at the last NATO strategic concept that was agreed in Madrid, it shows that level of political agreement and unity, on Russia and China. When you talk about the threats, Russia has a military problem set par excellence, and it's because of the Russian modernization, partial modernization of the nuclear forces, partial modernization of their conventional forces, and their forage into missile development and other things, coupled with the disarmament in Europe and the underinvestment and the lack of modernization, that has made Russia the genuine threat. I would argue Europe is perfectly capable of fielding a deterrent capability, which, supported by our nuclear umbrella and our high-end enablers, can ensure that NATO and Europe's eastern flank and Ukraine as a sovereign country and part of the larger Western community can be defended, can deter aggression. And when you look at the Chinese, this is a separate conversation. We're talking about Ukraine. I am not so sure that while China is a much greater threat, we talk about China as a pacing threat as opposed to Russia, as this kind of a near peer competitor. In Asia, we have a triple problem set. We've got the military, economic, and to some extent ideological problem set. And so that threat is clearly out there, and it's going to continue to grow. But to me, the argument that we should treat Ukraine and what's happening in Europe as simply a distraction, I think that's not an accurate argument, and that actually in this conflict, as the Russian military becomes ground down and, as I believe it can be, defeated in Ukraine, then it changes the global power equation fundamentally.
So we have a question from the audience from Kelly Blejos, which I'm going to turn to right now. And I just want to remind our audience that our panel is going to continue until 1/4 past the hour. So please do stick with us. The question is for you, Andrew, and it is, if you could just, and I'm paraphrasing here, but could you provide a little bit more detail as to precisely what Ukrainian military objectives need to be met before you would support the opening of some sort of negotiations to reach a settlement for this war? Because let's say, for argument's sake, that they don't meet those goals, and that, over the next year, 2, 3, we see this war continue either along a stalemate or the situation gets worse for Ukraine. At what point do you think it's in the Western interest at that point, theoretically, to cut our losses and to say, well, look, the Ukrainians may want to keep fighting here, but we've got interests of our own, including in the so-called Indo-Pacific region. What do we do then?
Well, I mean, and I'm not dodging the question, but I mean, when a country and a government is ready to negotiate, a country that has been attacked, unprovoked invasion, unprovoked aggression, with the kind of rhetoric that accompanied it, the demands that accompanied it, I think the principal part of that conversation is where the Ukrainian citizenry and the Ukrainian leadership is. But at a minimum, I would expect that before any conversations can start, that's for Kelly, is with a successful offensive that liberates a substantial portion of Ukrainian territory, because it demonstrates then to the Russian population, not just to the Ukrainian population, but also to the Russian population, that imperial chimera that Putin has been putting in front of them is just that. There's a larger question whether Russia needs to confront the reality of how power has changed globally and what it means to become, quote unquote, a normal state. I don't know. That is, again, an internal Russian conversation. I would put it in this way: any negotiations that allows for the status quo in place, in my view, would be synonymous with defeat. I would rely on the Ukrainian judgment as to what their domestic political dynamic, because it involves, and I think here Barry is right, every nation, has a point at which fatigue, destruction, all of that begins to play a role. But that's a conversation that has to happen internally in Ukraine, at what point they are willing to engage in that negotiation. But clearly, at least from everything I see and hear, I don't see any appetite in Ukraine right now among the population to cut a deal with forces in place as they are, even if Putin wanted to negotiate that, and I doubt that he does.
So we've also got the argument that came out in several articles previously, but also today in an article in Politico by Raj Menon and Daniel DePetris about just simply the notion that the Ukrainians and the Russians are nowhere near wanting to talk to each other right now. So Barry, I'm wondering how your proposal would play out in the real world. If the Ukrainians and the Russians don't want to talk, how can we make them? Are we going to threaten to withdraw military assistance from the Ukrainians, for example? What's your vision of how that actually comes about?
I don't think we can force them to talk. I think we can try and induce them, right? We may have to be a bit tough to use those inducements. And I should, in case it's not clear, I'm not 100% sure that we can make this happen now, or even if we can get a negotiation going, that we can take it somewhere that we want it to go. My point is it's in our interest to try, right? And here I have somewhat of a difference of opinion, not only with Andrew, but with many, and that is that I think we are entitled to have national interests in this war. And we are not obliged to basically bankroll the Ukrainian war and have no say in the policies for which that war is conducted, or in when it's time to start looking for a way out. We have interests too. And our interests are not synonymous with Ukraine's interests, right? And we're trying to manage many things. You mentioned China, which is everyone's favorite, but it's not just China. I mean, there are climate change issues in the world. There are issues of global markets that matter to developing countries for food and whatnot. There's a whole question of strategic nuclear arms control. Is anything going to be done to manage a three-way strategic nuclear competition? If we and the Russians now look at what's happening in Taiwan. If we're going full bore towards each other, there really isn't going to be any opportunity, any space to work on any of these other issues. Now, again, it's not to say, people, oh, you're prepared to throw Ukraine under the bus. It's not under the bus, right? But I do think that Ukraine's interest in recovering the Donbas might be very great. And our interest in recovering the Donbas really isn't very great, right? Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have interests in how this thing is settled, what the disposition of the Donbas is, what kind of political arrangement is made, right? We do, right? But it's entirely likely that Ukrainians are willing to keep fighting and asking us to bankroll wars to get the Donbas back for a year or two. It's hard to know how long they'll stay in the game. But the question comes back to what is in the U.S. interest, right? And I see all of the risks that we're running. I see that the costs that we're paying. I see the accumulation of costs that we and the Europeans are going to have to pay on the back end to help Ukraine rebuild itself. Russia's not going to help with that, right? The ongoing war has a lot of costs and risks. Now, to admit all that is not to say a negotiation will happen just because I make a reasoned approach to the participants, or that we get people in a room and start offering side payments that they can make a deal. They may not. It may fail. And in which case, we'll go back to our respective corners and the brawl will go on for another year. And if I'm right, it'll be a dynamic stalemate, and maybe you can try again in another year. But my point is, I I see the contours of the war, of the equilibrium in the war emerging, right? I don't see victory on the horizon. I went through my foreign affairs article and tried to figure out what the Ukrainian victory theories were. I couldn't see one that would work. I actually don't particularly see one that works for Russia, right? So this is why I think it's time to start working this problem. And if people don't want to actually sit down and work it, they should start asking the questions that one of the two of you asked, or maybe that Kelly Vallejo asked. If and when, say, a year from now, after each side has had a summer offensive and a fall offensive and a defensive after the hard freeze and another spring offensive, we're still more or less where we are. Is it time then for the Americans to say, look, everyone's been given a chance to realize their dreams. It's time to get serious here and end this thing. It's going to come.
Could I respond to this, Arda?
Please respond, because I also want to ask something else.
Yeah. Again, I'm trying to think, where have I ever said or written that Ukrainian interests is what should drive our policy, that we have no interests of our own, and that we shouldn't be prioritizing what matters to us? In fact, I've argued the opposite. I've argued that responding to this aggression in a way that finally, puts an end to 2 decades of territorial pressure, of pressure on our allies, of trying to divide us politically, of trying to get the United States out of Europe, of trying to turn the allies against us, make Germany dependent. We can just go on. This is in our interest, and I am not sure, for example, that what the Ukrainians would want to be the end of that conflict, the extent to which they would want to see the Russian military defeated, necessarily aligns where the United States should be, or where the Western European allies should be. But my point is that right now, a negotiation essentially creates the following situation. It dismembers Ukraine. It makes it all but an unviable state. It rewards the country that has not only launched this aggression, but is now wreaking havoc with Europe because of its, fluctuating energy market, playing games with turbines, essentially Turkey is a nice case here, where Putin just signed a deal on Turks buying gas from Russia and using rubles. So driving wedges between the alliance and trying to drive the United States essentially to a position where we are not able to maintain our relationships with our allies and our position in Europe. I think this is how I come at it. The fact that the Ukrainians are being butchered by the Russians, that should also concern us. I mean, we are looking at the kind of destruction that most of the people were saying was no longer even in the realm of the possible in Europe, and yet here we are.
Okay, so I'm gonna sort of ask about a lot of the proposals that you're laying out, Andrew. It seems to hinge on our unconditional support for Ukraine for now until they can regain some territory and have successful counteroffensive. Isn't that in some sense because of the relative disparity in power between Russia and Ukraine, and the fact that Russian population and its economic GDP and material resources dwarfs that of Ukraine? Wouldn't that at some level, at some point, involve putting troops on the ground, NATO or other forces to match that? And you really think that only by giving high technology arms to, or Western arms to Ukraine, that they can actually be triumphant over Russia? And I just want you to sort of lay out how you're so confident that by doing this, we are not risking escalation, because I don't think that's something that you approach. You mentioned that you don't consider that escalation risk to be high, not just a nuclear escalation, but just the involvement of NATO in Ukraine itself, which would essentially amount to some form of a disaster for the world in some sense.
First of all, never did I indicate that our support is, as you put it, are unconditional, that it should be unconditional support for Ukraine. In fact, it is not. It has not been from the start. We clearly define when we supply weapons as to what the ranges are. We provide a certain hardware. We have clearly articulated, I would argue, that while we support sovereign Ukraine, we want to maintain NATO's political unity. So we don't want the actions that Ukraine would be taking to jeopardize that, and that we don't want to have an all-out war with Ukraine. I think the conditions are pretty clear and they're on the table. That's number one. Number two, what in terms of the risk of escalation, we are to some extent self-deterring, because Putin is arguing, of course, insinuating, and especially if you watch Russian propaganda on television, this is quite an entertaining show where threats are being issued. One nuke and Berlin goes, another Riga goes. This kind of bluster. I am not so sure that we're nowhere near where that threat of nuclear escalation is high. It is there. It will always be there because we're dealing with the nuclear power. As for bringing NATO forces, look, if Putin starts throwing missiles, lobbing missiles into the Baltic states, into Poland, into Romania, this is going to be a NATO problem, and this was going to be a very different war. So it would not be a decision that, and I think NATO has been pretty clear about this, that NATO will not enter this war, but NATO will defend itself if NATO allies are attacked. We see this in our decisions to move the 5th Corps headquarters to Poland, increasing our presence in Europe, the exercises that we're introducing and the support that we're giving. So this is a conditional support. I think our interests are clearly articulated vis-a-vis the Ukrainians. And I think the overarching goal should be for us to essentially put an end to what has been a Russian campaign against the West since 2007. With these kinetic campaigns in Georgia, in Ukraine, Syria, where he's inserted himself, now wants to regulate, I guess, the refugee flows. And this can be done if the Ukrainians are properly supplied to counter what the Russians are putting in the field.
Barry, you have a response?
I guess I'm not 100% sure how a partial, even if the Ukrainians could generate a counteroffensive and take some of their real estate back, and this helped us get maybe a more equitable deal, I don't see that this particularly changes the dynamic between Russia and the West. This is oversell of the war, right? Vladimir Putin has a lot of resentment about the collapse of the USSR, and he has a lot of resentment about how Russia has been treated in the post-Cold War world, right? That's not going to go away. And the elite around him seems to share those feelings, and even a big chunk of the population does. So I don't think you can win a tactical victory in Ukraine that's going to produce a strategic transformation in Russia that's going to turn them into a liberal democracy or a modern technological
I never
state,
said anything like that.
Or no, you're never very clear about the outcomes that you say you're fighting.
Liberal democracy in Russia as a result of the war in Ukraine? Seriously.
But you paint a roseate picture of Russia's passive acceptance of being taken down a peg, and then they're not going to be a problem anymore because they did or did not take a province in Ukraine. This is not the way the relationship between the two parties is going to work. This is what I would call oversell of the war. Now, if what you want to argue is that Russia has really sharp elbows and they use a lot of really nasty methods, and every now and then somebody needs to give them a poke in the nose so that they know that this is problematical. I absolutely agree. And I think the Ukrainians deserve a lot of credit for giving the Russians this poke in the nose, right? But we come around to the basic problem here. I mean, what's the interest in having this go on, right? And the interest that Andrew is painting is that all kinds of wonderful things will happen if only Ukraine manages to win some kind of victory, which he can't quite explain, achieved in some way that he can't quite draw out, right? And this series of interlinked happy endings will produce some ultimate happy ending. And to me, it is breathtaking. I'll grant you that. It's a breathtaking chain of interleaved events that is meant to be produced by a successful Ukrainian tactical counteroffensive in the Donbas, but it doesn't seem that plausible to me. And the risks of trying to make it work seem to me to be very great.
Talking about war and happy endings and trying of insinuating that this is what my position has been. No, I mean, this is not my position.
People can read your piece. That is your position.
Barry, please.
No, it's not. I'm not talking about happy endings or liberal democracy in Russia as a result of that war. Where have you read that?
Well, I think, Andrew, that you did argue in one piece that you see Russia being transformed into a nation state, from empire to nation state, as a result of this war.
That's a far
but that's it to a certain extent. That's a more significant transition because it's not just regime change, it's not just political change, but it's national change on a scale of several centuries.
I care less about regime change in Russia. I think that's an internal thing for the Russians to debate and figure out. What I am interested in is about not having Russian troops and Russian tanks and Russian rockets, shelling at their neighboring countries and potentially triggering a wider war with NATO and the West. I mean, if this is not a very basic articulation of what our interests are, I don't know what is. I mean, we're looking at.
Let's end this war.
And I am not looking for liberal democracy in Russia or happy endings or whatever Barry says I'm looking for.
Okay, so we've only got 2 minutes left. We've got one question from the audience that I'm going to throw over to Andrew, and I'm going to ask you, Andrew, to answer that and to provide some closing thoughts as a whole, if you don't mind. And then I'll turn it to Barry to have the last word. And in both of your closing remarks, if you wouldn't mind perhaps engaging with some of the weaker points of your own arguments, if you think. So understanding and acknowledging the risks of your own positions, but also articulating why you think your own arguments are stronger than the potential risks of either position.
Thanks,
so the question.
Yeah.
But sorry, 1 second, Andrew. Is the question we have from the audience from George Beebe is that a year from now, it's possible that the resolve of the West might actually be less than it is right now in terms of providing high levels of military support to Ukraine. So should that be a variable in considering whether to press for a settlement now? That's his question. So if you could take that and some closing remarks, go ahead, and then over to Barry to wrap it up.
Yeah, it's very possible. And the biggest weakness, I think, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. And Barry, thank you for a spirited debate. I enjoyed it. I think the problem that keeps me awake at night, so to speak, is the extent to which political unity among the Western allies will hold going forward. I think that is a real issue, and that ties into your question about Western support in a year from now. I think we have clearly seen that what we have in Europe since the end of the Cold War is what I call regionalization of security optics. If you're a flank country, you're preoccupied with the Russian threat, especially if you're a former Soviet satellite. If you're in Estonia, you know that a lost war is an existential question, right? If you're Lithuania or Poland, whatnot. Then as you're moving farther west, this optic changes. Germany tried, I think unsuccessfully, to manage the relationship with Russia through economic and political means the French remain, in my view, focused predominantly south on the Med, on Africa and deep into the Sahel. So I'm bringing these examples because I would argue that what I'm concerned about the most in this current crisis is that political unity may not hold, and that even if it does hold on the surface in terms of statements, it will not translate into the willingness to share risks, and that means to supply Ukraine with the weapons it needs.
All right. Thank you, Andrew, and Barry. The last word to you.
I think we basically tread all over the ground. So all I'm going to do is just basically remind people my position. One, I think the war is probably stalemated now, and if it's not stalemated now, it will stalemate ultimately. When the parties recognize that is a different matter. I think we can help them recognize that, but we can't force them to recognize that. Second, we need to be mindful that there's a lot of risk. We've been very lucky so far, right? And the propensity of the war is to escalate, if only on little cat feet. And we keep experimenting, and the Russians are going to keep experimenting. And the chances for one side or the other to make a mistake are very high. Third, there are opportunity costs to having this intense war going on in Central Europe, right? There's lots of other things happening and other things we would like to do in other parts of the world that I think are important. Now, the weakness or the risk to my position is that the stalemate that I think I see either A is entirely chimerical, which is to say somebody knows better about what's happening on the Ukrainian or Russian side than I do, and one or the other will make a breakthrough. We have to consider the breakthrough could happen on the other side. We don't know what kind of shape the Russians are really in, so it can go either way. So it's possible that I'm entirely wrong about stalemate, or entirely wrong that stalemate is the likely place we're going to find ourselves a year from now. I think most of the permanently operating factors suggest that, but it's still possible. And second, even if we can get people together in the room, it's possible that we can't fabricate a deal that everybody will like, right? And it may be that that's one of the reasons people don't want to sit down. They're afraid that somehow, some way, their particular equities will be underserved in whatever negotiation is happening, and then everyone's going to turn on them, and they're going to be the party who basically screwed the thing up. And I get that, I understand it, but I think that it's the task of statesmanship to try and rise above those kinds of concerns and try and make something happen. And again, if not now, then I think we're going to come to it, right? And finally, I just make an observation about Andrew's concern about resolve. I'm not sure what I think about European resolve, but I don't think that it's necessarily infirmed by efforts to find a negotiated way to bring this war to an end, right? Because if it becomes the Russians table pounding that is the obstacle, then everyone knows there's no choice but to continue the fight, right? Having a hand extended for diplomacy also helps legitimate the war, right? And especially in liberal democracies. So to me, this is not about stop fighting and start negotiating. It's that fighting and negotiating have often gone hand in hand, and they should be going hand in hand now. We shouldn't be waiting.
Well, some excellent points on all sides, and it's wonderful to see both Andrew and Barry again, hopefully under better international circumstances next time. But I think that just the excellent points made on both sides really underscores the extent to which we live in complex times. And I think that this debate has really served as a result to enlighten some of the policy choices, the difficult trade-offs and policy choices that lie ahead, and hopefully will clarify those policy options for both the United States government as well as those listening in Canada as well. So let me just turn it over to Arta to extend thanks on behalf of myself and the Institute as well.
Thank you both, Barry and Andrew. I consider both of you friends, and thank you for accepting our invitation to be here. I think it was a spirited debate. We had so many more questions, and 1 hour, 75 minutes doesn't quite cover it, but I hope that we can have a lot of these conversations privately and other places moving forward. Again, thank you for everybody that tuned in. The recording will be available on the YouTube channel of IPD. And I urge all of you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow the next events that we will have. We have a lot of panels and discussions, debates such as this organized. Again, my gratitude to everyone here, and especially to Barry and Andrew. Thank you so much. Zach, thank you as well. And I would like to conclude the event now. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Barry.
hosting.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Arta. Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me.